So, in this part of our topic, we are going to get a hang of the individual expressions in the contemporary ventures in Indian folk art, and we are going to see quite a few artworks by the artists which are individual in its characteristic, and through the visuals again we are going to realize how the individualistic approach is coming out with the strong stylistic identity that is already codified for the artists, and it's very interesting to see how they're still attached to those traditional instructions and everything. At the same time, the kind of expression that they're coming up with are looking very, very individualistic, expressionistic, and very clear cut. So, let's see one example by Niranjan Chitrakar of Murshidabad. It's a scroll that I collected many years back, around 25 years back, and in that picture I could see, like I'm just showing you two or three images from there, just two images maybe from the part, and it's a repetitive image. The theme of the artwork was it's very simple. It's the hell scene, what happens to a person after death, as we know that they're connected to um, the existence of Yama, the god of forgiveness or the god of death, and that was part of each and every scroll that was there in the past. Now, this is done maybe 25 years back, cannot be called as a past because it's a very long and very old tradition that we are addressing right now. So, when Niranjan Chitrakar painted the scroll with the images of those ghosts, the imaginary ghosts who appear after death, and they take count of all the sins and virtues committed by the person when he or she was leaving, and then how the ghosts act. Right? They have this weird body language, and that is scary. What is important for the picture that I'll explain when you view the picture. So, the artist has used a very simple and basic means. It's done on a very basic brown paper that is available for packaging or wrapping things. So, that has a brownish base, and the artist liked that color. What we see in the picture is a few bold black lines, a tint of black, a very diluted transparent kind of a tint on the body to give it some kind of a volume and separate uh, the characters from its background, and then to highlight some of the characteristic features, the artist has used a opaque white paint on the eyes and the teeth of the characters. And the characters are the ghosts and the person, like the existing ghosts and the new ghosts. So that is how it is. What we generally see in the pictures, that all these people who have committed sin and getting bad experience after death, they're usually the female figures. So the breasts are suggestive of that. And otherwise, the figures are very simplified. The fingers and other things are highly stylized to make it more expressive. There are exaggeration in the body parts, the limbs. They're simplified and exaggerated, stretched, just to give the sense of the expression, which is very fearful and very kind of it's a creepy scene that they produced. So what we see here is very interestingly that the artist is using his own freedom of execution, which is it's a very different type of artwork, which is done in Murshidabad by Niranjan Chitrakar, who was quite acquainted with the Bengal Patachitra, the traditional one that we have seen from the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st century things. So, this person, he is from Midnapur, and he is following this tradition. And what we see in the picture is that the artwork has a strong connection with the Santali part also. We have seen it earlier also that painters from Murshidabad and Midnapur, they had this tendency of using a flat background and making the figure moving into the picture. So, this is just one example that I am using as a clue to understand how the individual freedom can be achieved through individual expressions. Now, what we see in this image is something which is of a very recent example that I have picked up. This is painted by Venkat Raman Singh, who is a Gond painter, and the title of the painting is The Smoked Taj. So, we can make out it's based on the recent incident where the terrorist attack took place in the Taj Hotel in Mumbai. The style of execution is very typical of the Gond painting tradition that we have studied earlier, but the subject matter is picked up. So, the theme is very contemporarized, and the theme is based on a current happening. So, all these things are also very simplified. There are birds which are also which has to be the symbols of peace, the pigeons, but their wings are also affected by the smoke. So, everything is getting blackened, and that is shown with a even texture, very typical of Gond painting. But then it's shifting from the traditional Gond and coming up with its own expression. This is another image taken from a recent website done by Pushpa Kumari, that is on the female ferticide. Again, the feminist subject matters are getting prominent, and it's also giving a very strong social message throughout, which is very effective, and nothing could have been more effective than this to spread awareness in such a way. Another painting that shows another very recent happening, which is connected to the investment scandal in West Bengal by the Sharda investment company. So, it shows how they have vandalized, and the kind of it's like how they multiplied the money. They promised the common people to show some better luck, and finally they betrayed. So, there are many eyes, many faces. That is a symbol of corruption, misuse, and then the victims, they're there in the foreground. So, these are some of the very recent expressions of the current affairs that makes it all the more interesting, that picking up one event that is happening around us. So, it's no Rama and Mahabharata or something, but the epics, the sagas of today's time. So, we are constantly encountering new stories, new resources that can really inspire the painters of today's time. So, it's not that the folk painters are still strongly holding their age old beliefs and old traditions. They are just picking up the most important thing from there, that is the stylistic identity, and they are choosing their subject matters with a lot of freedom as per their wishes. I'll show you some artworks by another very eminent artist of our time. He is Kalam Patua. The it's like when we see his work and interact with him, we find him to be doing something very significant, as he has consciously revived a very important urban folk tradition, which is known as Kalighat Pat painting, and we are going to discuss the significance of Kalighat Pat as a urban folk art tradition in our coming module. It's very important to know how that tradition got lost, and before that we are going to see Kalampatua in today's context, who taught himself in the manner. So, the style that he picked up for his artistic expression is the style of Kalighat painting, and then he is using his artistic freedom to come up with new images. He is responding to the social happenings of today's time with the same kind of executions. Let's watch his works and talk about it. So, this is a painting by Kalampatua made in 2013. The title of the artwork is Exhibition, Watercolor on Paper. It was displayed in Gallery Space, New Delhi. What we see in the picture is the scene from a recent art exhibition where the paintings are in display, but the viewers and the visitors who were there, who were present there, they're busy in socializing, they're talking to each other, they're indulged into drinking, clicking photographs, and the paintings are not getting the kind of attention it deserves. So it has a satiric aspect to it, to how the modern life and the sensibilities of the modern art, like modern life, is shown in the execution to it. Kalampatua's ancestors were idol makers and not scroll painters of Kalighat, but the entice of the market brought them to Kalighat. Those who prospered settled down in the purlieu of the Kalighat temple in Kolkata to drill and continue with the newly formed urban genre. Kalam Patua is impressed by the expressive boldness and the potential of this popular Kalighat style, made a conscious effort to master the art from under the tutelage of his uncle Baidyanath Patua, and adopted this style for his artistic expression, as narrated to me by Kalampatua. He adds, the Kalighat Pat belongs to a temple tradition that thrived in 19th century Kolkata. The painting initially depicted images of deities and picture scrolls depicting Ramayan, Krishna Lila, Chaitanya Lila, among many other themes. Eventually, the narrative extended to secular and social themes, satirizing the high middle class group of people known as Babus, who ridiculously were into superficial emulation of the European cultural values, leading to cultural disasters. The Patua expression of this time embodies the nonsense of that predicament that evoked in simplicity of style and expression. Kalampatua's art goes beyond his ancestry to evoke the same social intelligence in a contemporary situate. He is moderately vocal in his language of ridiculing the obsessed consumerism of the new urban middle class, a postmaster by profession in the Postal Department, Government of India. His works range from modest portrayals of childhood memories of pastoral life to caricaturing the sudden rise of urban middle class and their deceitful change to blatant physicality, absorbing the Patua tradition of Kalighat painting of robust lines and tones. He includes his range with a unique harmonious blend of the traditional and contemporary. Kalam's paintings branch out from the obsolete Kalighat Patachitra, once painted profusely. He was included in the retrospective show of Kalighat painting at the National Gallery of Modern Art, NGMA, from the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1990. Kalam was commissioned to paint a scroll illustrating the story of French Revolution by Alias Francais in Calcutta and later explored communal violence and dowry deaths at themes of his paintings. The Victoria and Albert Museum, London, has entered and exhibited Kalam's work in its touring exhibition across South Asia. His works are also in the collection of the National Museum in Liverpool, UK, the Museum of Civilization in Canada, the Chicago Children's Museum, and the Lekha and Anupam Poddar collection. Kalampatua works as a postmaster in Chandpura sub post office in West Bengal with the unchanged presence of sarcasm and humor. It is not the 18th century Babus mocked by ancestors. His completion is aptly adhered to his proximate surroundings. Kalam's second solo exhibition at Gallery Space includes a series of paintings based on simple watchfulness towards the trivial life, even in the final detail to trace the social sensibility and the tongue in cheek interpretation of contemporary happenings and prejudice in the current context. In all the artworks of Kalampatua, he shows the simple life and daily life scenes all over. Of the subject matters are very mundane and very simple. So, in this painting, what we see is that the kind of line, the volume that is created here, and the space division that is very typical of Kalighat painting. So, it shows his training in Kalighat Patachitra, but the subject matter is very contemporary. So, upon asking him, I got to know that the subject matter was that one lady had a ear pain and she's taken to a doctor uh, to a different city for the medical checkup by her husband. So both of them are traveling by train when some jhalmuri wala or those who sell some snacks which is made out of parched rice. He is selling the thing and offering that to the wife, but she is not much interested in having that. And then there is one Baul who is a roving minstrel. He is singing in the train, and there are other people who are also moving around. Another very interesting subject matter from his childhood memory from the same exhibition, where there are people who are crossing a river during the flood, and as we can see that one child who is not able to swim and he needs support, he is just putting the stick on the brother's mouth, and that way he's getting some support because both the hands of the brothers are occupied. Then in the next image we see something very interesting, that is that Lotus temple of New Delhi At the background, two girls are sitting and posing for a photograph. A dog is also uh, waiting for them. It's sitting there very peacefully. And there's a photographer with jeans and a leather bag clicking their photograph. And these girls are posing for him. The figures are typical of Kalighat urban Patachitra, the Sundaris, the beauties that was there. So he used them in a very interesting manner in this artwork. This is another very interesting things from a very secular and common subject matter, where it's a tailor shop, and there are model sitting there, and the person is selling the garment. Somebody has ordered for some clothes and they got the delivery and going out, and there's a mannequin standing there. There are several mannequins. So he's the tailor who takes order. He's sitting with his typical Caesar and supplying the order. There's a fan on top of the thing. So it's like a running business and a very interesting scene. Again, a picture where the husband takes the photograph of the wife who is dressed up like the traditional Sundari. His son is at the background, and of course, he's not part of the picture, so he's not very formally dressed. And the husband is clicking the photograph with his mobile phone. It's not a camera, but also a camera with a mobile phone. So, what we see in the picture is the use of line, which is very flowy and voluminous. It's rendered, and the kind of tone that is produced there, it's not as flat as the rural folk paintings. So, it has that urban quality into the paintings. Again, the very surreal image that he produced through two of these pictures. One is where the ferry, which is otherwise located and on top of Victoria Memorial Hall in Kolkata, and it used to rotate earlier and now it doesn't rotate anymore. So, according to Kalampatua, he imagined that the ferry is on the sky and moving around in the imagination of the photographer, who is quite baffled to see her there, and he's wondering whether it's reality or it's the fact. So he's wondering. He just lifted his camera down and he's watching the beauty on the sky. So it's a dreamlike image with lots of fantasies and facts there. And the next one is getting the furnitures made. So the dream room and the dream furniture. So a carpenter is making a furniture out of a plywood, and the person who has commissioned the work to the carpenter is dreaming of his dream bed where he is going to lie down. So that has some realist aspect to it. There are images, what we see in the torso and the other parts, that there are images of like it's just a dual identity of the breasts and the eyes of an owl. So the mystery of the body and also the transparency of the drapery, which is done with a simple means of a brush line and some color tints, are amazing here. So there the lady is waiting, all bathed and waiting for somebody. So the person whom she is imagining is there in the picture frame. Again, another depiction of the traditional Kalighat painting style in the hand of the expert painter Kalampatua of our time. Another image, very surreal, where it's more like the character is playing a flute and the bird is listening to it. So it's all about the hypnotized condition, where it's almost like a semi surreal image, and it's highly ambiguous as the formation of the animal, the human figure, and everything is placed there. So it's highly imaginative and beautiful. There are two typical Ganesha from Kalighat tradition, very expressive, and the volume is created in a very different manner. It's not as flat as the other folk and minor art examples that we have gone through. So everywhere they tried to maintain a volume which is very roundish, if not exactly anatomical. So it was to realize the potential of the styles that is already there prevailing in the traditional folk and minor art of India. They're varied, there are lots of technical possibilities, and there are potential of expressionistic possibilities also. And many artists in today's time, whether they belong to that tradition or not, they're picking up all the stylistic sensibilities which are established long back with a lot of conviction. It's wise to pick up the sensibilities that are there prevailing in the folk and minor art, the traditional paintings of our country. And when we talk about their survival, this is also for sure that it can only survive through change. So, if we pick up all these artworks as the creative expressions of today's time, we see that the tradition is surviving through them. So, that is indicating the sustainability aspect of a traditional visual culture in our country.